December 1999, Madison Square Garden, New York City. 20,000 fans packed into one of the world's most legendary venues for what was supposed to be Whitney Houston's triumphant return to her hometown. The My Love Is Your Love tour was at its peak, and this night was being recorded for a potential live album. Everything was riding on this performance. But then, during the one song everyone came to hear, during the climactic moment of I Will Always Love You, something happened that sent shockwaves through the entire arena. Whitney's voice, the voice that had been called the greatest instrument in popular music, suddenly cracked. Not just a small crack, but a devastating, audible fracture that echoed through 20,000 people in complete silence. What happened next wasn't just about a vocal mistake. It was about fear, vulnerability, and the moment when perfection shattered to reveal something far more powerful. The truth about what it costs to be called the greatest. If you're ready to witness the night Whitney Houston showed us that being human is more important than being perfect, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this story will break your heart and put it back together again. Let's dive into the moment that changed everything. To understand what happened that December night at Madison Square Garden, you need to understand the impossible standard Whitney Houston had set for herself and the crushing weight of living up to the title she'd been given since she was barely out of her teens. The voice. By 1999, Whitney had been performing professionally for nearly 15 years. She had sold over 150 million records worldwide. She had won countless awards. She had broken barriers for Black women in pop music. But most significantly, she had established herself as the benchmark by which all other female vocalists were measured. Whitney's voice wasn't just good. It was considered technically perfect. Music professors used her recordings to teach proper vocal technique. Other singers openly admitted they couldn't match her range, her control, or her power. She could hit notes that seemed impossible, hold them longer than seemed humanly feasible, and do it all while making it look effortless. But perfection is a prison, and by 1999, Whitney was serving a life sentence. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was already showing cracks that the tabloids were eagerly documenting. Her record label was pressuring her for another blockbuster album. And most devastatingly, her own voice was beginning to show signs of wear from years of relentless touring, recording, and the physical toll of maintaining an impossible standard. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, who had worked with her since the late 80s, noticed the changes first. She was pushing too hard, he recalled years later. Her technique had always been flawless, but now she was compensating for fatigue by using force instead of finesse. I tried to warn her that she needed rest, but there was too much riding on the tour. Too many people depending on her. The My Love Is Your Love album had been Whitney's attempt to reinvent herself for a new generation. The title track had become a massive hit, proving she could adapt to contemporary R&B sounds without losing her signature style. But the tour supporting the album was grueling. 50 cities in 6 months, with almost no breaks between shows. But perfection is a prison, and by 1999, Whitney was serving a life sentence. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was already showing cracks that the tabloids were eagerly documenting. Her record label was pressuring her for another blockbuster album. And most devastatingly, her own voice was beginning to show signs of wear from years of relentless touring, recording, and the physical toll of maintaining an impossible standard. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, who had worked with her since the late 80s, noticed the changes first. She was pushing too hard, he recalled years later. Her technique had always been flawless, but now she was compensating for fatigue by using force instead of finesse. I tried to warn her that she needed rest, but there was too much riding on the tour. Too many people depending on her. The My Love Is Your Love album had been Whitney's attempt to reinvent herself for a new generation. The title track had become a massive hit, proving she could adapt to contemporary R&B sounds without losing her signature style. But the tour supporting the album was grueling. 50 cities in 6 months, with almost no breaks between shows. The Madison Square Garden performance was scheduled as the centerpiece of the tour. This was Whitney's hometown venue, the place where she'd performed some of her most legendary concerts. The show was being professionally recorded for a potential live album, and music industry executives, critics, and celebrities filled the audience. This wasn't just another concert. This was a statement performance that would either cement Whitney's continued dominance or expose any vulnerabilities. Whitney knew all of this. In the days leading up to the Madison Square Garden show, her anxiety was visible to everyone on her team. She had always been a perfectionist, but now that perfectionism had become something darker. An obsession born from fear. What if I can't do it anymore? She had confided to her longtime friend and background singer, BB Winans, the night before the show. What if everyone realizes I'm not as good as they think I am? BB had tried to reassure her, reminding her of the thousands of flawless performances she'd already delivered. But Whitney's fear wasn't rational. It was the fear that lives in every performer who's ever been called the greatest. The fear that one mistake will erase everything they've achieved. On the afternoon of December 12th, 1999, Whitney arrived at Madison Square Garden 6 hours before showtime. She went through her usual pre-show ritual with an intensity that worried her team. Vocal warm-ups that lasted twice as long as normal. Multiple costume changes, because nothing felt right. And repeated requests to review the set list, as if she could somehow rehearse her way into guaranteed perfection. Her tour manager, Shep Gordon, watched her with growing concern. "She's running on fumes," he told the production team. "I've never seen her this anxious before a show." But when Gordon suggested they consider postponing, or at least cutting some of the more vocally demanding songs from the set list, Whitney refused. "No," she said firmly. "This is Madison Square Garden. These people paid to hear me sing. They paid to hear me sing, 'I Will Always Love You.' And that's exactly what they're going to get." What Whitney didn't say, but what everyone around her understood, was that she needed to prove to herself that she still could. That despite the exhaustion, despite the rumors, despite her own growing doubts, she was still Whitney Houston. Still the voice. Still capable of perfection. As the arena began filling with 20,000 fans, Whitney stood backstage staring at herself in the mirror, preparing to deliver a performance that would either validate everything she believed about herself or shatter the carefully constructed image she'd spent 15 years building. She had no idea it would be both. When Whitney Houston walked onto the Madison Square Garden stage that December night, the roar from 20,000 fans was deafening. This was her city, her people, her moment. She opened with "I'm Every Woman," moving through the choreography with her characteristic grace and power. Her voice sounded strong, confident, everything her fans expected and demanded. Song after song, Whitney delivered. "How Will I Know" brought the arena to its feet with nostalgia for her early years. "I Wanna Dance with Somebody" had everyone singing along, their voices blending with hers in a celebration of pure joy. "My Love Is Your Love," her recent hit, proved she could still dominate contemporary radio. For the first 90 minutes, everything was perfect. Whitney's band was tight, her background singers were flawless, and the production was spectacular. The recording engineers were capturing every note for what was shaping up to be an incredible live album. Whitney seemed to be relaxing into the performance, finally letting go of the anxiety that had consumed her before the show. But backstage, her vocal coach Gary Catona was watching the monitors with growing concern. "She's pushing," he muttered to himself. "She's not pacing herself." Every singer has a vocal budget for each performance, an understanding of how much power they can expend on each song while still preserving enough strength for the entire show. Whitney, driven by her need to prove herself, was spending her budget too quickly. By the time Whitney reached the ballad section of her set, the section where she typically performed her most vocally demanding songs, she had already given more than most singers could give in an entire career. But the biggest challenge was still ahead. "I Will Always Love You," the song that had defined her career, that had become her signature, that people around the world identified with Whitney Houston more than any other piece of music ever recorded. The song had started as a Dolly Parton composition, a gentle country ballad about bittersweet goodbye. But Whitney's version for the Bodyguard soundtrack had transformed it into something else entirely. A vocal masterpiece that showcased everything that made her the greatest singer of her generation. The song structure was vocally brutal. It started soft and intimate, requiring control and subtlety, then built slowly through increasingly challenging passages, before culminating in a final chorus that demanded every ounce of power, range, and stamina a singer possessed. That final, "I Will Always Love You," required hitting and sustaining a note in the highest part of Whitney's range, holding it with perfect tone and control, then executing a rundown through multiple notes without wavering or breaking. It was the musical equivalent of an Olympic gymnast's dismount. The single moment where everything could either come together perfectly or fall apart completely. Whitney had performed this song thousands of times. She could sing it in her sleep. She had hit that final note flawlessly at the Grammy Awards, at concerts around the world, in studios, on television. It was as much a part of her as breathing. But on this December night in 1999, with her voice fatigued from the grueling tour, with the pressure of the recording and the hometown crowd, with her own doubts whispering in her ear, something went wrong. As the band began the opening chords of I Will Always Love You, the crowd erupted. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. 20,000 people fell into respectful silence as Whitney began the soft opening verse. If I should stay, I would only be in your way. Her voice was gentle, intimate, perfect. The verses progressed beautifully, each one building in intensity exactly as it should. Whitney was navigating the song's challenging structure with her usual mastery. She reached the first big chorus, her voice soaring through the arena with power and precision. The crowd was mesmerized, watching the vocal gymnastics they'd come to expect from the greatest singer alive. Then came the bridge, the quiet moment before the final explosive chorus. Whitney sang it perfectly, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire arena. This was the setup, the deep breath before the leap. The final chorus began. The music swelled. Whitney prepared to deliver the money note, the moment that would bring 20,000 people to their feet in awe. And I. Her voice began to climb toward the high note. Will always. She reached for the note that she'd hit perfectly 1,000 times before. Love. And then it happened. Her voice cracked. Not slightly. Not subtly. It was a devastating, audible fracture that cut through the arena like broken glass. The note that was supposed to soar simply broke apart in her throat. 20,000 people heard it. The recording engineers captured it. Whitney felt it. The greatest voice in popular music had just failed in front of everyone. The moment Whitney's voice cracked on that crucial note, time seemed to stop inside Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people collectively held their breath, frozen in disbelief at what they'd just heard. This wasn't Whitney Houston. This wasn't the voice. This wasn't possible. Whitney stood center stage, microphone in hand, the music still playing around her as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The one thing she'd feared most, the nightmare that had haunted her through all the pressure and exhaustion, had just come true in front of her hometown crowd and recording equipment that would preserve this moment forever. For a performer of Whitney's caliber, this moment represented more than just a vocal mistake. It was the exposure of vulnerability that she'd spent 15 years hiding behind technical perfection. It was every doubt, every fear, every whispered criticism from tabloids and critics suddenly given physical form in that broken note. The audience didn't know how to react. Some people gasped audibly. Others looked at each other in confusion, wondering if they'd really heard what they thought they'd heard. The music continued playing, programmed to reach the song's ending regardless of what happened with the vocals. But Whitney wasn't singing anymore. She had stopped completely, standing motionless at center stage. Backstage, her team watched in horror. Gary Katona, her vocal coach, felt his heart sink. Shep Gordon, her tour manager, was already calculating how to handle the fallout. The recording engineers looked at each other, wondering if they should stop recording or pretend this wasn't happening. But the person most devastated by that broken note was Whitney herself. Years later, B.B. Winans would describe what he saw on Whitney's face in that moment. It was like watching someone's worst fear come to life, he said. Not just embarrassment or disappointment, but this profound sense of failure. Whitney had built her entire identity on being perfect, on being the voice that never failed. And now, in front of everyone who mattered, that identity had just shattered along with that note. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, Whitney stood silent on stage. The music faded out. The arena remained quiet, 20,000 people waiting to see what would happen next. Would she try again? Would she leave the stage? Would she pretend it hadn't happened and move on to the next song? What Whitney did next shocked everyone in that arena, but especially those who knew her best. Instead of running away from the moment, she walked toward it. Instead of hiding the vulnerability, she exposed it completely. Whitney slowly brought the microphone back to her lips and spoke to the crowd, her voice small and raw in a way no one had ever heard before. "I'm sorry," she said simply. The two words hung in the air, carrying more weight than any perfectly sung note ever could. The crowd remained silent, not sure how to respond. Whitney continued, her voice stronger now but still vulnerable. "I've been singing that song for 7 years. Every night, every performance, trying to make it perfect for you. Trying to be perfect for you." She paused, and those watching closely could see tears forming in her eyes. "But tonight, my voice isn't perfect. Tonight, I'm not perfect. And I need you to know something." A few people in the front rows began to understand where this was going, and they started to murmur supportively. But Whitney held up her hand, asking for silence. She wasn't finished. "I need you to know that I'm scared," Whitney said, her voice cracking again, but this time from emotion rather than vocal failure. "I'm scared every single night that I won't be good enough, that I won't be what you expect, that I'll let you down." The arena was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on Whitney's words. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was something far more rare and precious. This was truth. "For 15 years, Whitney continued, "I've been trying to be the voice. This perfect instrument that never makes mistakes, that always delivers exactly what you want. But you know what? I'm not a voice. I'm a person. And people get tired. People get scared. People crack." The emotion in her final word, the way she said crack with such raw honesty, hit the audience like a physical force. Several people in the front rows began to cry. Whitney wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "So here's what I'm going to do," she said. "I'm going to sing this song again. But this time, I'm not going to sing it as Whitney Houston, the perfect voice. I'm going to sing it as Whitney, the woman who's scared and tired and just wants to tell you that I will always love you, even if I can't always hit the high notes." What happened next was extraordinary. As the band started the opening chords of "I Will Always Love You" for the second time, 20,000 people began to applaud. Not the wild, screaming applause of fans celebrating perfection, but the warm, supportive applause of people witnessing courage. When Whitney Houston began singing "I Will Always Love You" for the second time that night at Madison Square Garden, something had fundamentally changed. The pressure of perfection had been released. The prison of impossible expectations had been opened. And the woman who emerged from that crack in her voice was somehow more powerful than the perfect performer who had walked onto that stage 2 hours earlier. She started the opening verse differently this time. Instead of the controlled, technically perfect delivery she'd always used, there was something raw in her voice. A fragility that made every word feel more honest, more real. "If I should stay, I would only be in your way." The words took on new meaning when sung by someone who had just admitted to fear and exhaustion. The audience listened with an intensity that went beyond typical concert attention. They weren't just hearing Whitney Houston sing anymore. They were witnessing something unprecedented in the career of one of music's greatest perfectionists. They were watching her choose authenticity over flawlessness. As the song progressed through its verses and built toward the challenging choruses, the entire arena seemed to be holding its collective breath. Not from anticipation of technical mastery, but from genuine concern for the woman on stage who had made herself vulnerable in front of 20,000 people. Whitney reached the first big chorus, and her voice soared through it with surprising strength. But it wasn't the effortless power she'd always demonstrated before. This time, you could hear the effort. You could hear her reaching, striving, fighting for every note. And somehow, that made it more beautiful. Sarah Chun, a music journalist from Rolling Stone who was covering the concert, later wrote that what happened during that second performance of "I Will Always Love You" was the most emotionally powerful moment she'd ever witnessed in 30 years of covering live music. "We spend so much time celebrating technical perfection," Chun wrote, "that we forget music is supposed to be about emotion, about connection, about truth." Whitney gave us all of that when she stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real. The song built toward the final chorus, the moment where Whitney's voice had cracked so devastatingly just minutes before. Everyone in the arena knew it was coming. The tension was unbearable. When Whitney reached that crucial passage, she did something unexpected. Instead of trying to hit the impossibly high note that had broken before, she modified it. She sang the line in a slightly lower register, then executed a different run, one that was still impressive but within her current vocal capability. It was a choice no one had ever seen Whitney Houston make before. An admission that perfection wasn't possible tonight, and that was okay. But then something magical happened. As Whitney held the final sustained note of the song, her voice doing something different than it had done in thousands of previous performances, the entire audience began to sing with her. 20,000 voices joined together, not to cover up her imperfection, but to support it. To say, "We're with you. We've got you." The final notes of "I Will Always Love You" were sung not by Whitney Houston, the perfect voice, but by Whitney Houston and 20,000 friends who had just learned that sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in. When the song ended, the applause was unlike anything Madison Square Garden had ever heard. People weren't just standing, they were crying, cheering, and applauding with an intensity that went far beyond appreciation for a good performance. They were celebrating courage. They were celebrating vulnerability. They were celebrating the moment when one of music's most perfect performers had chosen to be imperfectly human. Whitney stood on stage, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response. She had walked onto that stage terrified that one mistake would destroy everything she'd built. Instead, she discovered that her humanity was more powerful than her perfection had ever been. Before moving on to the next song, Whitney spoke one more time to the audience. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me that you didn't fall in love with the voice. You fell in love with me. And I promise to stop hiding behind perfection and start sharing the real me with you." From that moment forward, the rest of the concert had a different energy. Whitney sang with more freedom, more emotion, more connection than she had in years. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She was just being present, being human, being real. The recording of that concert was never released as a live album. The technical imperfections were too obvious, and Whitney's team worried about how it would be received. But bootleg recordings of that night became legendary among Whitney's true fans, not despite the crack in her voice, but because of it. The morning after the Madison Square Garden concert, Whitney Houston woke up in her hotel suite expecting the worst. She imagined devastating reviews, cruel tabloid headlines, and industry whispers that her voice was finished. She had exposed her vulnerability in front of 20,000 people and countless recording devices. Surely this would be the end of everything she'd worked for. But when her publicist arrived with the morning's press coverage, Whitney discovered something remarkable. The reviews weren't focused on the vocal crack at all. Instead, they were praising what came after it. The New York Times headline read, "Whitney Houston's Triumph of Humanity Over Perfection." The Daily News called it the night music's greatest voice taught us something more important than perfect notes. Music critic John Perels wrote in his review, "For years, we've celebrated Whitney Houston for being superhuman. Last night at Madison Square Garden, she gave us something more valuable. She showed us she was human. And in that humanity, she found a power that technical perfection could never achieve." The response from fans was even more overwhelming. Within hours, the phone lines to radio stations across New York were flooded with calls from people who had been at the concert. They weren't complaining about the imperfection. They were calling to say it was the most moving concert experience of their lives. Social media was still in its infancy in 1999, but early internet forums dedicated to Whitney Houston exploded with activity. Fans who had been at Madison Square Garden shared their experiences, and the overwhelming sentiment was the same. Whitney's vulnerability had created a connection far more powerful than her perfection ever had. Maria Santos, a schoolteacher from the Bronx who had been in the audience that night, started an email chain that eventually reached over 10,000 people. "I've been a Whitney fan since I was a teenager," she wrote. "I've seen her perform a dozen times, and every show was technically perfect. But last night was the first time I felt like I really knew her. The first time I felt like she was singing to me, not performing for me." The impact on Whitney herself was profound. In the days following the concert, she spent long hours in conversation with her closest friends and confidants, processing what had happened and what it meant for her future. B.B. Winans later recalled a conversation he had with Whitney 2 days after the Madison Square Garden show. "She told me it felt like she'd been carrying a 1,000-pound weight for 15 years, B.B. said, and in that moment when her voice cracked, the weight fell off. She said for the first time since she became famous, she felt free. But the freedom came with challenges. Whitney had built her entire identity around being perfect, and letting go of that identity meant figuring out who she was without it. Her relationship with her voice changed fundamentally after that night. Instead of seeing it as an instrument that had to perform flawlessly every time, she began treating it with the respect and care it deserved. She's finally accepting that she's human, Gary Katona, her vocal coach, told friends. She's finally understanding that even the greatest voices need rest, need care, need permission to not be perfect every single time. Whitney began making changes to protect her voice and her well-being. She reduced her touring schedule, insisting on adequate rest days between performances. She started saying no to record label pressure for constant output. Most significantly, she began modifying songs in her live performances to suit her voice on any given night, rather than forcing herself to replicate recorded versions perfectly. The Madison Square Garden moment also influenced Whitney's approach to younger artists. She became a mentor to several emerging singers, and her advice to them always included a warning about the prison of perfection. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you that you have to be perfect every time, she told Christina Aguilera during a conversation about vocal technique in 2000. Your humanity is your greatest instrument, not your voice. However, the lesson came too late to prevent some of the struggles that would define Whitney's later years. The issues she'd been dealing with in 1999, the pressure, the exhaustion, the need to maintain an impossible standard had already taken their toll in ways that went beyond just vocal fatigue. Her marriage to Bobby Brown continued to deteriorate. The substance abuse issues that she'd been managing privately became increasingly difficult to control. And the music industry continued to demand more than any human being could sustainably give. But those who were closest to Whitney said that the Madison Square Garden moment remained a touchstone for her throughout the difficult years that followed. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by expectations or pressure, she would remember the night her voice cracked and 20,000 people loved her more, not less. She would remember that her humanity was more powerful than her perfection. In 2009, during what would be one of her final major interviews, Whitney was asked about the defining moments of her career. Most people expected her to mention the Grammy Awards, the Super Bowl performance, or the massive success of The Bodyguard. Instead, she talked about Madison Square Garden in December 1999. That was the night I stopped being the voice and started being Whitney, she said. That was the night I learned that people don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with truth. The bootleg recordings of that concert continued to circulate among fans, and in later years, after Whitney's death in 2012, those recordings took on even greater significance. They became a reminder not of her struggles or her imperfections, but of her courage. The courage to be vulnerable in front of 20,000 people. The courage to choose authenticity over image. The courage to show that even the greatest among us are still human. Music historians and vocal experts now point to the Madison Square Garden concert as a turning point not just in Whitney's career, but in how we think about live performance and authenticity in popular music. Dr. Rachel Morrison from Berklee College of Music has used the concert in her classes on performance psychology. What Whitney Houston did that night was revolutionary, Morrison explains to her students. In an industry that demands perfection and punishes mistakes, she chose to embrace her imperfection and, in doing so, created something far more meaningful than technical mastery ever could. When Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, the world mourned the loss of one of the greatest voices in music history. Tributes poured in from around the globe, celebrating her technical prowess, her groundbreaking achievements, and her incredible body of work. But among those who had been at Madison Square Garden that December night in 1999, there was something else being mourned. The loss of a woman who had shown them that perfection isn't what makes us worthy of love. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in. The Madison Square Garden concert, and specifically that moment when Whitney's voice cracked during I Will Always Love You, became a story that was passed down among her most devoted fans. Not as a story of failure, but as a story of transformation. A reminder that even the greatest among us are human, and that humanity is something to celebrate, not hide. In the years since Whitney's death, Several artists have cited that Madison Square Garden moment as influential in their own approach to performance and vulnerability. Adele, who has openly discussed her own struggles with stage fright and the pressure of live performance, mentioned Whitney's example in a 2015 interview. "When I heard the story about Whitney's voice cracking and what she did afterward, it changed how I thought about performing," Adele said. "It made me realize that the moments when we're most vulnerable are often the moments when we connect most deeply with people." Lady Gaga, during her 2019 Las Vegas residency, shared a similar sentiment when discussing the pressure of live performance. "Whitney Houston taught me that it's okay to be scared, that it's okay to not be perfect," Gaga told her audience. "She taught me that our fans love us not for being flawless, but for being real." The message of that December night in 1999 has also resonated beyond the music industry. Therapists and mental health professionals have used Whitney's example when working with clients who struggle with perfectionism and the fear of failure. Dr. Linda Martinez, a clinical psychologist specializing in performance anxiety, regularly references the story in her practice. "So many of my clients believe that their worth is tied to being perfect," Dr. Martinez explains. Whitney Houston's example shows them that vulnerability and imperfection don't diminish us. They make us more fully human. In 2019, Madison Square Garden installed a small plaque backstage in the area where Whitney had prepared for that December 1999 concert. The plaque reads, "In memory of Whitney Houston, who taught us that courage isn't about being perfect. It's about being real." December 12, 1999. The bootleg recording of that concert, once hidden and passed secretly among fans, was officially released as part of a Whitney Houston archive collection in 2020. The producers of the collection debated whether to include the unedited version with a vocal crack or a polished version that cleaned up the imperfections. In the end, they chose to release it exactly as it happened, crack and all. The liner notes for the release explain the decision. "This recording captures Whitney Houston at one of her most courageously vulnerable moments. To edit out the imperfection would be to diminish the power of what happened that night. The moment when one of music's greatest perfectionists chose authenticity over flawlessness, and in doing so, reminded us all of what really matters." The release was met with overwhelming positive response from fans and critics alike. Many listeners reported that the unedited version, with all its imperfections, was more moving than any of Whitney's technically perfect recordings. For those who were in Madison Square Garden that night, the memory remains vivid decades later. Sarah Chin, the music journalist who covered the concert, wrote a retrospective piece for Rolling Stone in 2022, 30 years after that night. "I've covered thousands of concerts in my career," Chin wrote. "I've seen legendary performances, historic moments, incredible displays of musical virtuosity. But the night Whitney Houston's voice cracked and she chose to be human instead of perfect remains the most powerful moment I've ever witnessed in live music. It reminds us that the purpose of art isn't to demonstrate technical mastery. It's to create connection, to share truth, to remind us of our common humanity." The story of Whitney's cracked note has taken on almost mythical status among musicians and music fans. It's become shorthand for the idea that vulnerability and authenticity are more powerful than technical perfection. When young artists express anxiety about making mistakes in performance, they're often reminded, even Whitney Houston's voice cracked at Madison Square Garden, and it became one of the most beautiful moments of her career. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to that December night in 1999 comes from the fans who were there, who witnessed the transformation firsthand. Many of them gathered for an informal memorial at Madison Square Garden on the anniversary of that concert in 2013, 1 year after Whitney's death. They came together to share their memories and to sing "I Will Always Love You" together, not in perfect technical harmony, but in heartfelt, imperfect, beautifully human unison. And when they reached that crucial high note, the note that had cracked so devastatingly for Whitney years before, they sang it together, supporting each other, reminding each other that we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. That sometimes our imperfections are what make us most beautiful. That sometimes the cracks are exactly where the light gets in. The story of Whitney Houston's cracked note at Madison Square Garden isn't really about music or vocal technique, or even about fame. It's about the universal human struggle between the person we think we need to be and the person we actually are. Whitney Houston spent 15 years trying to be perfect. trying to be the voice that never failed, never faltered, never showed weakness. She believed that her worth, her value, her right to be loved depended on maintaining that impossible standard. And when that standard finally became impossible to maintain, when her voice cracked in front of 20,000 people, she discovered something that would change her forever. Perfection isn't what makes us worthy of love. Humanity is. How many of us are living as Whitney did before that night, exhausting ourselves trying to maintain an image of perfection, terrified that if people see our cracks, our struggles, our vulnerabilities, they'll stop loving us, stop respecting us, stop valuing us? Whitney's story teaches us that the opposite is true. When she stopped trying to be perfect and started being real, people didn't love her less. They loved her more. They connected with her on a deeper level because finally, they could see themselves in her. Her perfection had been admirable, but her humanity was relatable. In our social media age, where everyone presents carefully curated versions of themselves, where filters and editing allow us to hide every imperfection, Whitney's Madison Square Garden moment is more relevant than ever. It reminds us that the most powerful thing we can share with each other isn't our highlight reel. It's our truth. Our struggles, our fears, our moments when things don't go according to plan. The night Whitney Houston's voice cracked, she taught 20,000 people, and eventually millions more, that courage isn't about never failing. It's about what you do when you do fail. Do you hide? Do you run away? Do you pretend it didn't happen? Or do you face it, acknowledge it, and show people that you're strong enough to be vulnerable? Whitney chose vulnerability, and in doing so, she gave everyone watching permission to do the same. Permission to be imperfect, to be human, to crack and not be destroyed by it. The standing ovation that night wasn't for technical mastery. It was for courage, for authenticity, for showing that even the greatest among us are still human, and that's not something to hide. It's something to celebrate. So the next time you feel the pressure to be perfect, remember Whitney Houston at Madison Square Garden. Remember that the moment her voice cracked was the moment she finally set herself free. And remember that the cracks aren't something to be ashamed of. Sometimes, the cracks are exactly where the light gets in.